Okay, I guess we should get started. So I'm just going to welcome everybody and introduce myself. And I'll do it in my language and then interpret it for everybody afterwards. If I say an Algonquin or Anishinaabe word, I'll always say the English version afterwards.
Sorry, Bob, just to let everyone know this session is being recorded. Thank you. Okay, Bob.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Easy Disnakaz, Algonquin Nation, Dunjaba, Mikanaptka Tidodum. And I just said my name is the Eagle, and my language, I'm from the Algonquin Nation, and I'm Turtle Clan. And we're going to talk today a little bit about the formation of what is now Canada. But we really have to go back kind of in history to have an understanding of what how we are the way we are today in what is now Canada. So I'm going to start a slide or a PowerPoint for you guys, because for me, I'm a person who learns from hearing and seeing better than I do from reading. So for me, even looking at my own PowerPoints, it helps me to take things in just a little bit more. So let me get that started. And again, I want to welcome everybody and hope everybody is doing well. It certainly feels like winter time today. But when you think about it, 3 weeks from now, we'll be into March. Once we get into March, then we can kind of start to see the light of or the end of the tunnel of winter and spring starting to come. And this winter is very, very harder than our normal winters because of COVID and isolation. And in the wintertime, you can be even more isolated than you are in any other season of the year. So it's especially hard right now for a lot of people. So I'm just going to do a short prayer before we begin, because part of it for me when I do these teachings, they're not my teachings. They've been things that have been taught to me by different teachers and elders and medicine people that I have worked with and went to sweat lodges with, and I've been a firekeeper for, and but we all have more than one teacher, so I want to acknowledge them for their knowledge and passing that on. Short prayer. Kweke, Kitchimanado, Magizi Disnaka, Algonquin Nation, Nujaba, Mishomis, Nokomis, grandmother, grandfather. Please help and look after the people, the human beings. We pray for the people, long life, prosperity, and peace, and health. And we please look after the little ones who in these particular times, I think, are really having a tough time adjusting and as little ones. So please protect those little ones and the elders and the elderly. We say Chimegwich, thank you. Kichimanadu, the Great Spirit or God. Aye. Okay, so let's get on to this PowerPoint. Today we're going to be talking about the formation of Canada. And these particular things, they're called wampum belts. And wampum really is a shell bead. And we'll go into that a little bit. But this is just a picture of replicas of wampum belts over the years. And okay, you can go to the next one. And I just wanted to, I put this up because a lot of people aren't really aware of this. In 1492, an estimated 90 to 112 million Indigenous people lived in the American continent. The population in what is now Canada and the United States at that particular time was 18 million. And in fact, we were more populous here than they were in Europe at the time. And we had a very sophisticated political, health, economic, and social systems, as well as a very intricate economic system. And we had trade routes from as far north as you could go to as far south, east, and west. And in fact, we created, because there were so many nations and languages throughout North America, we created a sign languages. So when we were trading with each other, that we would be able to communicate. Okay. And I show this because I want people to have an understanding too of, if you look at this map, and this was before or at the time of European contact with North America, you notice all these areas. These are all different countries of what we now call First Nations in Canada at the particular time. And if you look way down at the bottom, that's my nation, the Algonquin Nation. And we'll be talking today mostly around the Great Lakes area, because that's when kind of the first contact here in North America, or in Canada, what is now Canada, began. Okay, go ahead, Julian. This is just another a copy of a wampum belt. And wampum belts are really, in a sense, they're our way of writing, of keeping records of whether it's a treaty with another nation or an agreement. This is how we record it, and what was said and agreed to at that particular time. And I'll get a little bit more intricate into wampum belts once we get a few. And this is a picture of one of the shells. And if you notice in the wampum belts, they're all different colors, and usually white and purple. And that came from this particular shell. Broken up and sewed all together, kind of like little beads. Okay, Julian. The wampum is used to significate the importance of the authority of the message associated with, as such treaties and others, such agreements, it would have a large amount of wampum that would be loomed into a belt for them. And it's not really a belt, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. When you look at this, this is a very important belt. And this is the first wampum that was agreed to between a European nation and a First Nation here in what is, we call it Turtle Island, but that's North America. And we call it Turtle Island because when you look from above, North America resembles a turtle. And this is called the Row Wampum. I can't really see it very great because but it was, we called it, it was a Haudenosaunee, and Haudenosaunee people are the people of the Longhouse, or the Iroquois people. And when you look at this, it was when it's 1613, and the Dutch were in the Iroquois, the Mohawks, part of the Iroquois Confederation, one of the nations within that confederation, were in northern New York State at the particular time. So on the south side of the Great Lakes, and so the Dutch had started to build a settlement in Mohawk territory, and in our belief that we can't own the land. We can be custodians of it, but because God created it, we can't own land. just like we can't own water or air, or but we are custodians of that land. That's our responsibility here on Turtle Island. And so because of that view, when the Dutch came into the Mohawk Haudenosaunee territory and started to settle there, the Mohawks realized that they need to make an agreement with those Dutch people that were settling there, and because they had to figure out how they were going to share that land in a good way. And so they came with this Wampum belt, and it's called the two-row wampum because the belt symbolizes the river of life. And the three white parts is that river, and the two purple stripes going down under the middle of it are the Mohawk in their canoe and the Dutch in their wooden ship. And they're traveling down the river of life together, side by side. And so the ships or the canoe had all the Haudenosaunee or Mohawks culture, language, value systems, all those particular things within their canoe. And so did the Dutch have all their cultural and language and spirituality and everything within their wooden ship. And the understanding was that they could sail together down that river, the river of life, but with no interference with each other's, what we call them bundles, which contain all our ways of knowing and doing, without interfering with those particular things. And the three white lines also represent peace, friendship, and trust between those two nations. And when we do come to an understanding or agreement with Wampum, we become relatives then. And we need to be able to be good with this, with each other, and be respectful. So this type of wampum was called a peace and friendship wampum. And let me just go could you go to the next one? And this is basically when in each, and as you see there, there's some elders, and they're probably the belt keepers of these particular belts. Could you go back, Julie? You see the two-row wampum in the middle there. And this is basically what it reads to be, although it's a lot longer. As long as the sun shines upon this earth, that is how long our agreement will stand. Second, as long as the water still flows. And third, as long as the grass grows green at a certain time of year. Now we have symbolized this agreement, and it shall be binding forever as long as Mother Earth is still in motion. So it was this agreement between the Mohawk people and the Dutch that they'd share that land in a good way with each other through friendship, trust, and peace, and forever. And when there were disagreements, every Wampum Belt has a belt keeper, and that belt keeper knows everything that was said and agreed upon. And that belt keeper, whether it was a man or a woman, would bring that. If there were disagreements, they would bring that belt out. And sometimes it's said that they would do it every year, and whether it was within the Dutch colony or within the Mohawks territory. One would be a guest to next territory, and vice versa. And the guests would get up once a year, if they were able to do it once a year, and read what was on that belt. And then the host would get up and read the belt to make sure that they had they were on the same page in regards to that, the knowledge of that agreement. and if there were difficulties, they would try to work it out during these meetings. Okay, Jillian. Now, when we look at before European contact here, one of the things that was happening in Europe between 1754 and 1763 was something called the 7 Years' War. And what had happened in the to create the 7 Years' War, the strongest nations in Europe were vying to be the most powerful. So we're looking at Spain, England, Portugal, the Dutch, and probably there were other nations involved in this. So they went to war against each other, actually, to become the most powerful. And one of the major ones is I forgot to mention France. And part of this was, and I'm not going to get into it because we only have an hour today, and to get into the intricacies of some of the history would take us a long time. But what created this struggle within Europe with each other was that something called the Doctrine of Discovery, which was issued by the Catholic Church, the Pope, in, I believe, the early 1400s, I guess, or 1300s. And basically, the Doctrine of Discovery basically said that that any explorer from a Christian explorer from any of the nations was able to go out and explore if they explored and found new land, and that land wasn't occupied by Christians, that those people were not considered human beings, and that God gave them the right, the Christian explorers gave them the right to go in and take that land, because those people, because they were not considered human, weren't able to manage that land properly. So it gave them the right to convert the indigenous people, and this is all over the world, not just in Turtle Island or North America, convert, enslave, or kill to take that land. And so all those countries started vying for the different indigenous nations for the resources, so they became the most powerful. And here in what is North America, the two main, if you're interested, you really should look at the Doctrine of Discovery and do a little research on it, because most people have never heard of it before. But it's if you look at what's happening in the United States today, that started with the Doctrine of Discovery, and what happened with indigenous people, non-Christians, all over the world. And I don't want to get into it, and I'm not judging in regards to it, because in my teaching, people know the medicine wheel, the four colors are the four original people, nations here that Humanity or God created, all human beings on earth, and we're supposed to get together. He separated us and gave us things to teach, and we're supposed to come back together in the seventh fire, and some believe we are the seventh fire, and that we were given prophets to teach, and we were all given the original teachings about how to be good human beings here on this earth, because we're in my teachings, we're spiritual beings put on this earth for a very short time to experience the physical, and to learn from that. So we all had our teachers, and unfortunately, the Doctrine of Discovery was not based on Christian values. It was based on politics and economics, which is unfortunate. Anyways, can you go back just to in 1763, the war ended, and with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, France had to cede all its territory to the British, and at that particular time, there wasn't a Canada and there wasn't a United States. So the French had to give up all the territory that they had claimed, which is what is now Quebec and parts of Ontario. Okay, go ahead, Jolie, next one. I'm going to talk about him in a minute or so, but I want to talk about the French and the British here in North America at that time, because they had built up relationship and allyships. They built up relations economically, politically, militarily, with some were aligned with the British, which were mostly the Haudenosaunee people, the Iroquois people, and the Anishinaabe people, the nations all around the Great Lake, my nation, the Algonquin Nation, were aligned with the French because they came into contact with the French earlier, and the Mohawk or the Haudenosaunee, the six nations, or five at that particular time, lived south of on the south side of all the Great Lakes, and Anishinaabe lived on the north side of all the Great Lakes. So there were, again, what I said, alliances between the French and most of the Anishinaabes north on the north side of the Great Lakes, and with the British, it was the Iroquois who were in the south side of the Great Lakes. And once Britain won against the French the 7 Years' War, they had to, again, like I say, gave up all their territory. So the British weren't too happy in regards to, because the other side had aligned with the French, the British started to punish the ones that had been allied, those First Nations, and treating them and this is somebody called Chief Pontiac, and we'll get into him in a minute, but he allied all the Anishinaabe or Anishinaabe on the north side of the Great Lakes together to fight against the British. Okay, Jolene, if you want to go ahead. And at the particular time, if you look at this particular map, Pontiac allied all these First Nations to go to war against the British here in what is now Canada and the United States at that particular time, although either one didn't exist at that time. But this is a map of all the British forts that were attacked and either captured or destroyed by this alliance of First Nations. Okay, Jolene, go ahead. And so the British realized that they had to do something to appease the First Nations, or they would be basically forced out of North America at that particular time, because the forces of the First Nations were too great for them at that time. And so they came up with this internal document called the Proclamation of 1763. And again, it was an internal document. It wasn't negotiated with the First Nations. But what it basically said, it outlined the guidelines for European settlement within Aboriginal territories, which is now called North America. And the Royal Proclamation was initially issued by King George III, and it recognized the ownership of the land, the Indigenous lands here by the Indigenous people. And it explicitly states that Aboriginal title has existed and continues to exist, and that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty. And so that the only way that Britain at that particular time could share land and treaties from the Indigenous standpoint here in Canada and North America were about sharing of the land, not selling of the land to. So this was an important document that said that Aboriginal title did exist and still exists, and that there were sovereign nations, those First Nations and sovereign nations. And why I'm saying this and why I brought up the doctrine of discovery is that the doctrine basically said that Aboriginal title or Indigenous title to land doesn't exist because of terra nullius, which is a Latin term that means vacant land or empty land. And it was empty land from their definition because it wasn't populated with Christians. So even today in Canada, when we talk about Crown land and a lot of the misunderstanding about Indigenous lands or Indigenous nations' lands and territories is that the underlying premise of Canada owning this land is from the doctrine of discovery, and that's why they call it Crown land. And so that fight's still going on, but I don't want to get into that again. And if you're interested, you should really look at that history because it gives you a real different understanding of our history. Like the doctrine of discovery created the African slave trade and the taking of land and all over the world, actually. Okay. And so when the proclamation was made by the British Crown, and this map is what the proclamation basically stated. And if you look on the right-hand side, kind of the more darker pink, this is the original 13 colonies of the United States. And they were looking to expand out west. So this is on the East Coast, and those 13 colonies wanted to be able to expand westward. And so they got very, very angry with Britain for the English for this. If you look in the middle part, the light pink, that is the territories that Britain basically said that they couldn't touch, and they had to do it through mutual treaty with the First Nations, the Indigenous nations in this territory. And if you look on the far left, that was claimed by Spain at that particular time, but that eventually eroded. Okay, Jolene. And this is a fort. You call it Fort Niagara, and this was a fort that the French ceded to the British. Jolene, can you do me a favor? If I don't have a clock here, so I don't want to go over time. So if you can tell me when there's 15 minutes left, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. So this was taken over by the British, and this is in just over the border from Niagara Falls, Niagara on the lake. And taken over by the British again, like I said. And it's an important fort, and I'll tell you in a minute why. The story I wanted to tell you about this is that a couple of years ago in the summer, I persuaded my wife to go. I wanted to go and look at this fort, and it's over in Queenston, New York, just over the river, over the border there. And the history there And this is really a historical museum within New York State, Queenston, New York, or Lewiston, I guess, not Queenston, sorry. And it's full of a lot of American history. And the Proclamation is not mentioned in this particular, anywhere in this museum. And the reason why is because the Americans were so angry with the British for creating the Proclamation of 1763. So it's fascinating. Okay. This is a picture of me on the wall. No, it's not really, but this is my daughter, Rebecca. Her Algonquin name is Nungoskwe, Star Woman, and she's holding a wampum belt called the Silver Covenant Chain, the Treaty of Niagara. So we talked about the Proclamation again. That was an internal document by the British. I'm going to go back to this picture in a few minutes because I want to explain what these symbols that are. Okay, Jolene, go to the next one. Again, the Silver Covenant Chain. Go one more. Okay, so what the Treaty of Niagara was, after the Proclamation came out, Sir William Johnson was the British head of the British Department for Indians, for the British that were here in what is now Canada. And because of the trouble with the attack of the First Nations and basically the defeat of Britain here in what is now Canada, he sent out copies of the Proclamation of 1763 to all the Indian nations, Indigenous nations, and invited them to come to Fort Niagara to discuss peace with them. So they had runners go out. My nation, the British asked my nation, the Algonquin nation, to send runners. And runners were where people would go out to the different nations, Indigenous nations, to give them messages, that sort of thing. So the Algonquin nation did that. And to be invited to Fort Niagara to discuss peace. And a lot of the Indigenous nations were very leery of attending this because they thought it might be a trick or a trap for them. So they did ceremony in that, and they decided to go to Niagara to meet. And that particular belt, okay, can we go back one to the, that's a good one, yeah. This particular belt was commissioned by the British to give to the Indigenous nations because Sir William Johnson's realized that to make this successful, he had to approach the Indigenous nations within an understanding of the First Nations or the Indigenous nations that he had invited. And our diplomacy at the time, and for thousands or 1,000 years at least, was through wampum diplomacy. And wampum diplomacy was making peace with each other and in a way to share the land in a good way with each other. And this belt, again, commissioned by Sir William Johnson and presented to the First Nations, But it was presented. There was about 3,500 representatives that came from all these Indigenous nations to Niagara-on-the-Lake. We stayed at Niagara-on-the-Lake, the British were over in Fort Niagara across the river, and when they met, it would be back and forth between both sides. And so, can we go back to the last one? It just gives us a better picture. So, and it basically said that we recognize your sovereignty, and that we would like to be together and as friends and peace, and peace. And this particular belt is called the Silver Covenant Chain Belt, for the Treaty of 1764. When you look at the symbols, you have two figures in the middle, and each one represents the Indigenous people here in Turtle Island, and then one represents the, thank you, Jolene, the British Crown, and together as sovereign nations. And when you look at the little squares there, actually that's symbolic of a chain holding it together. And when you look at those diamonds represents each people's council fires or territory. And so it's the British and the Indigenous nations. And we didn't have letters at the time. That was put in by the British. But it was made by actually a Mohawk woman, or designed by a Mohawk woman for the British, and made so the British would understand it, and was presented to. Now, if you look at the fringes of those little strings coming out, when we read it, say as Western European, we would go from the left to the right in reading it and what that meant. As in Anishinaabe or Anishinaabeg, or we do everything in a circle. There's no beginning, no end. And so when you take those fringes, and put them together, tie them together, it's a circle. So it tells the story, it completes the story, it completes the circle. And that's our way of reading it. And again, each belt had a belt keeper that would do this. And we called it the Silver Covenant Chain because there were other thoughts about what to name it, whether it's a rope, what rope praise, well, could it be metal? No metal rust. So we called it the Silver Covenant Chain because silver tarnishes, but you can polish that silver once it tarnishes. So what, okay, can you go a couple ahead now, Jolene? Yep, again, and one more. And these are, and I'm doing this very quick, but like I said, there were 300 or 3,000, approximately 3,500 leaders of these particular nations that ended there to negotiate over a 3-month period. And they did come to an agreement to share these wampum belts and become relatives with the British. And this wampum on top is called the 24 Nations Wampum Belt. And that represents the 24 nations of the Indigenous nations. And if you look on the British, and if you look at the right-hand side, that's the British wooden ship, and that represents England, the British homeland. And if you look on the left, that's a wigwam or a house in Anishinaabe for those nations. And so that's North America, and that the ship is Britain. And this was about being each other's allies. So this particular belt, if the British needed some help, all they had to do is give a tug, and then the indigenous nations would come to their help, and vice versa. And this is one of the reasons that a few years later, in 1812, that these indigenous nations supported Britain in the War of 1812 against the Americans. And these nations came from as far away as BC, what is now BC, Nova Scotia, down into the western states, north, south. So they agreed on, and this wampum was commissioned and presented to the indigenous nations by the British. Okay, next one. We can go back that. If anybody wants a copy of this, I have no problem mailing it out. This is, I'm just going to go over this quickly because we're running out of time. But at one point in history, the Iroquois people, the Haudenosaunee people, and the Anishinaabe people were at odds with each other. They were warring. And so after a time, they decided to become allies and relatives again. And this is called the dish with one spoon, Wampum Belt. And it represents sharing of the land. So dish with one spoon is really, these nations had all these resources and they had to share them in a good way. So this was the belt, and the Whiteduck were part of this too. And actually it takes in all territory, basically. All of Quebec and into Ontario, basically. So this belt is still in effect here. And that in the middle, that square represents the two council fires of each particular nation. And the picture on your left is my dad, who's a Anishinaabe. He's passed his spirit world now, and a Haudenosaunee man. And I thought it was apropos to have a picture of a Haudenosaunee people with a longhouse and an Anishinaabe man, because these were the ones that shared this wampum together. Okay, go to the next one, Jolene. Now, these medals were presented by the British to the leaders of these particular First Nations that attended and agreed to the wampum of 1764 and 24 Nations Belt. And you can see on the top, it is an eagle's wing. An eagle in our cultures is a very, very important symbol and very, very important. So it shows that happy, well united, and they're smoking the prayer pipe. A lot of you may have heard of the peace pipe, but there is no such thing as a peace pipe. We call it a prayer pipe. We can pray for peace, but usually after a meeting or the agreement of a wampum belt, we'll share that prayer pipe with each other and pass it around in a circle. And we smoke tobacco there, and I won't get into that. Tobacco is our most important medicine, but the tobacco back then was natural tobacco, so there wasn't any chemicals or anything like that, and we'd smoke it, but we wouldn't inhale it. The prayer pipe was given to us as a gift by God, Gitchie-Manitou, the Great Spirit, and He gave us that pipe so we could smoke and let the tobacco smoke sema out and blow it out to go up to take our prayers to the Creator, Gitchie-Manitou, or God. So a ceremony, a pipe ceremony at the end of the agreement on a treaty or a wampum belt relationship was done with a prayer pipe and a prayer where everybody was involved, both sides. Okay. And so that means because of these particular wampums, that along with the Proclamation of 1763 and the Silver Covenant Chain, Niagara 1764 Wampum Belt, that Canada it's laid the foundations for Canada and Britain to share the territory in what is now Canada in a good way. And so it was the beginning of the treaty process here in Canada, what is now Canada, to form what is now Canada. So Canada was formed by treaty agreements. And treaty agreements through wampum we became relatives with each other. So to share the land in a good way. And again, going back to the proclamation that the British couldn't take any land unless it was agreed upon mutual agreement through wampum and treaty. And in Canada today, you can't step foot anywhere in Canada without being on treaty land. And one of the things that we do when we do, and I'm going to do it at the end, is land acknowledgements, because it's a reminder to us of that we did share the land and in a good way, or it meant in a good way. And one thing I didn't mention, I should have mentioned, is when the British presented these two wampum belts to the Indigenous nations there, the leaders of the Indigenous nations. The Indigenous nations presented to them, the British, the two Row Wampum, reminding them of their responsibilities in regards to that wampum. And all the wampums since the two Row Wampum are peace and friendship treaties, agreements, and relationships. So those particular belts are huge in the formation of what is now Canada. So treaty, when we say we're all treaty people, it means that the Indigenous people, the nations, their leaders negotiated and agreed to treaty relationships on our behalf. And your leaders negotiate these treaties on your behalf. So that's why all Canadian citizens, and even the ones that aren't citizens now who live here in what is now Canada, have treaty responsibilities, because their government representatives negotiated with them, for them, and so we have responsibilities, treaty responsibilities too, because our leadership negotiated these treaties. So that's why in Canada, we are all treaty people. Again, this is a very short, really Cole's note version of within an hour of this. It is a huge. When we put those two things together, actually, the Proclamation of 1763, really in the Treaty of Niagara, represent our Magna Carta to the Indigenous people here. And it's unfortunate when we go down further into our history the doctrine of discovery rears its ugly head. But that's for another time. But these wampums are very, very important. It's to the formation of Canada, and there wouldn't be a Canada unless the Treaty of Niagara in 1764 was negotiated and shared between the British and the Indigenous nations here in what is now Canada. So I'm going to open it up now to if anybody has oh, can you go one more? Oh, nothing. Okay. So if people want, I have some resources that a couple of books that would be useful, and there is a, if you Google "We're All Treaty People" or the Treaty of Niagara, 1764. There is a video called "We Are All Treaty People." That's quite interesting, and it gives you kind of an overview of it also. Okay, does anybody have any questions? And by the way, the belts were not worn around the waist. They were actually thrown over the shoulder. I have replicas of these belts, but they're at work, so I can't get them. But I usually, when I'm doing a presentation, so they go over the shoulder, kind of like a slap down here, and they're tied together on there. And actually, if you were the importance of these particular wampums, if you could be warring with another nation, and if you saw somebody out walking that was wearing one of these belts, you couldn't harm them because they were considered to have diplomatic immunity. That's how respected the agreements and the belts were. And sometimes when we have to travel with to different territories, they would put these belts up on in their canoes through by a stick, a T, and they would and that would show that they had diplomatic immunity. Okay, so I'm going to leave it open for questions. Now we're running out of time. Any questions from anybody? Okay, no questions. Unfortunately, it's been a long time since the Silver Covenant chain was last polished, because when the Indian Act came into effect in 1876, that Silver Covenant chain was made illegal by the British government that was in charge at that particular time, and then later by the Canadian government. So it hasn't been polished in a long, long time. Through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of their calls to action is to go back to that relationship of the 1764. Yes, I can share that. If people want a list, they could just let us know and give us your email, and I can share that. I had it on my PowerPoint. I had added it later after I sent this to Jolene. I thought I could just upload it. So it took a long time to make these belts, because there were thousands of these shells that had to be broken down, polished, and sewn together. So it was quite so it could take weeks to do this, if not months, depending on the size of the wampum belt. Some were longer and bigger than others, and that sort of thing. Any other questions?
I'd get going, but thank you very much. Have a good
You're
day.
welcome. Wedge, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yes. Sorry about, I was going to do the land acknowledgement. And it's important to do it, and I apologize for letting it slip. I was kind of in a rush trying to get all this in. So I just want to acknowledge that we're in the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Anishinaabe, and what we in most recently the Mississauga Credit First Nation, who is in a treaty relationship with Canada. Okay, thank you everybody. Chimigwich. And again, if you want me to get these resources, I will certainly send them out to you.